I'm Edward, here to keep you company as the day winds down, sending a warm and special hello to everyone tuning in from Peterborough, Canada. If you enjoy spending these quiet moments with our stories, you can now find them on Spotify. The link is in the description. Now settle back and listen. Chapter 1. The sign turned before the usual hour. Early March arrived in St Mary Mead with the particular quietness that belongs to that uncertain month. Not quite the end of winter, not yet the beginning of anything warmer, but possessed of a certain grey and gentle light that softened the outlines of the high street, and made the village look, to anyone who paused to observe it, rather like a watercolour that had not yet been finished. The elm trees along the lane were still bare, though a faint swelling at the tips of the smaller branches hinted at intentions not yet fulfilled. The mornings were cold. The afternoons were cold also, though one occasionally caught, if the sun found a gap in the clouds, a thin warmth that lingered just long enough to encourage a person to remove their scarf before thinking better of it. Miss Jane Marple had lived in St Mary Mead for rather more years than she took any particular pleasure in counting. Her cottage, which sat at a comfortable remove from the centre of the village, was a place of orderly habit and modest industry. The garden, though still dormant in its March reserve, received her attention nonetheless. There was always something to note, yet some small evidence of preparation beneath the soil that rewarded careful observation. It was this habit of attention, applied not only to gardens but to the full range of human behaviour, that had made Miss Marple, over the years, rather more useful to the village than the village always recognised. She was not a tall woman, nor a particularly striking one. She had the look of someone's favourite great-aunt. Pale blue eyes behind neat spectacles, white hair arranged with care, and a manner of listening that other people sometimes mistook for simple politeness. She had a gift for knitting, for gentle inquiry, and for remembering with remarkable precision the things that people said when they believed they were saying nothing of importance. On the morning in question, Miss Marple had walked into the village at her usual hour, which was not so early as to invite comment nor so late as to miss anything of interest. She had stopped briefly at the post office to collect a small parcel from her niece in Torquay, exchanged a few words with Mrs. Partridge on the matter of the church flower rota, and then turned down Market Lane in the direction of Trent's coffee shop, which had become, in the short month since it had opened, one of the most agreeable features of that unremarkable street. The shop had been established the previous October by Miss Eliza Trent, a woman of perhaps 35 who had come to St Mary Mead from somewhere further north. Derby, it was generally understood, though one or two people maintained it, had been Nottingham, and the distinction seemed to matter to them more than it could reasonably have been expected to. Miss Trent was quiet, was capable and efficient without being cold. She had a way of remembering how each of her regular customers took their coffee, and she managed the small establishment, 4 tables inside, 2 tucked beneath the bow window, 2 against the opposite wall, with a composure that the village had quickly come to rely upon. The shop opened each morning at 8:30, and remained open until 4:30 in the afternoon. This was a schedule that Miss Trent maintained with the precision of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, that regularity is itself a form of reassurance. The sign above the door, white letters on a dark green ground, Trent's, with the hours printed smaller beneath, had become a familiar feature of Market Lane in the same unconscious way that a particular church bell or a baker's window might become familiar, noticed only when it was absent. The regular visitors were a small but consistent company. Mr. Norris Crail was among them, a solicitor's clerk of middle age and careful dress, who stopped in each weekday morning between 9 and 10, ordered a single cup of coffee with no milk, read the newspaper with practised concentration, and left a 3-penny tip which he placed beneath the saucer rather than upon the table, as though to moderate both his generosity and his visibility. He was a thin man with a long, pale face and the slightly pressed look of someone who had once hoped for something better and had since arrived at a dignified accommodation with what he had instead. Mrs. Eda Fellows was another regular. She was a widow of some years' standing, comfortably placed, with a tendency to appear at the shop in the early afternoon when the luncheon hour had passed and the village returned to its quieter rhythms. Mrs. Fellows was a stout, cheerful woman of 60 or so, with hair of an enterprising auburn that had been maintained against some evidence to the contrary, and a gift for conversation that did not always require a willing interlocutor. She was fond of Miss Trent and had told her so on several occasions, adding that it was a great relief to have a decent cup of coffee within walking distance, as the previous occupant of the premises had run a tobacconist's and the smell had never quite left the walls. Young Mr. Geoffrey Peel sometimes came in at irregular hours, a thin, eager young man of perhaps 22 or 23, who worked at the ironmonger's at the far end of the lane, and who had the look of someone accustomed to being underestimated. He was not a confident young man, but he was observant, and he had a way of sitting very still at his table when someone else was speaking that suggested he was taking in considerably more than his expression admitted. And there was Miss Harriet Vane, not the writer, as she was careful to note, though she had observed that the name sometimes created a moment of confusion which she did not find entirely disagreeable, who was the retired headmistress of a small school in the next village, and who came to Trent's on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons with a library book, and a disciplined intention to read it, which she achieved with varying success depending on who else was present. It was into this agreeable community of habit that Miss Marple had herself become a not infrequent visitor. She did not come every day. Her own kitchen produced a very satisfactory cup of tea, but she came often enough to have established a relationship of mutual cordiality with Miss Trent and a passing acquaintance with most of the shop's regular visitors. On the afternoon of the 7th of March, Miss Marple had intended to stop at Trent's on her way back from a visit to Dr. Sanderson's surgery, where she'd gone to collect a prescription. It was just after 3 o'clock when she turned into Market Lane. The light was beginning to thin, as it did at that hour in early March, draining the colour from the brickwork and leaving the street with a slightly monochrome quality that was not unpleasant, but was certainly conclusive on the subject of summer being some time away. She saw the sign from a distance of perhaps 30 yards. It had been turned. The word "closed" faced outward, and the door, she observed as she drew closer, was not merely shut but locked. She could see the position of the latch, and there was something about the stillness of the interior, visible through the lower portion of the glass, that confirmed the observation without requiring further investigation. The lights inside had been extinguished. A small piece of paper had been affixed to the inside of the glass with a strip of gummed tape. It read, in Miss Trent's familiar neat hand, "Closed for the day. Apologies for any inconvenience." That was all. Miss Marple stood before the door for a moment. The message was polite, as Miss Trent's manner was always polite. It explained nothing, which was perhaps to be expected of such a notice, and yet there was something in it that gave Miss Marple a small and particular pause. The phrase for the day was precise, not temporarily, not due to unforeseen circumstances, which might have been the natural form of words. For the day, which implied that tomorrow would be different, and yet the quality of the closure, the lights off, the careful message, the locked door with the latch set fully, had about it something that did not quite match the confident return implied by that phrase. She read the notice once more, then turned from the door and continued on her way. It was Mrs. Fellows who mentioned it first at the Church Bazaar Committee meeting the following morning, with the mildly aggrieved air of someone who had been caused a minor inconvenience and felt entitled to observe it. "The coffee shop was closed yesterday," she said, to no one in particular and everyone generally. "At 3 o'clock, if you can imagine. I walked all the way down the lane." "Perhaps Miss Trent was unwell," suggested Mrs. Partridge. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Fellows, Sears with the tone of someone who was not entirely satisfied with this explanation, but could not immediately produce a better one. Miss Marple, who was sorting bookmarks at the far end of the table, said nothing. She continued to sort the bookmarks with the careful patience that was her habitual manner in company, and she listened. What she heard in the course of the next 20 minutes was that Miss Trent had not been seen that morning. The shop had not opened. Mrs. Fellows had gone past at 9 and again at 10, and the sign remained as it had been the previous afternoon. A note had appeared, a different one, this time on a small card tucked into the frame beside the door, which said simply, "Closed until further notice." Miss Marple looked up from the bookmarks. "And no one," she said gently, to no one in particular, "has thought to inquire after her?" There was a brief silence. "Well," said Mrs. Partridge after a moment, "I assumed she had her reasons." Miss Marple said nothing further on the subject. She sorted the remaining bookmarks with great attentiveness, and presently the committee moved on to the question of the cake stall. But she thought, on her walk home through the cold March air, that regular places do not change their habits without reason, and that the reasons given, or, in this case, the reasons not given, were sometimes rather more instructive than those offered plainly. She thought also of the quality of the light in the shop window as she had passed it, the particular stillness that belongs not to a place where someone will shortly return, but to a place from which someone has already, in some essential sense, departed. It was a distinction she had learned to recognise. Chapter 2. The cup left. Cooling by the window. There is a particular way in which a village absorbs an unusual event, not with drama, nor with the sustained attention of a larger place, but with a series of small acknowledgments that ripple outward from the original disturbance and then, if nothing further happens to sustain them, gradually subside. The coffee shop's closure was the sort of event that produced precisely this effect. It was noted, discussed in passing, offered as a topic at 2 or 3 separate breakfast tables on the morning of the 8th of March, and then, when the morning itself moved on and brought with it other small matters, a letter delivered to the wrong address, a van blocking the entrance to the butcher's yard, a report of snowdrops appearing rather earlier than expected in Mrs. Allardyce's garden. It settled into the background of village consciousness without having been resolved. Miss Marple, for her part, did not find this especially surprising. Villagers were not always incurious so much as they were practised in the art of patience. If something was to be explained, it would be explained in time, and until then it was generally considered more comfortable to proceed on the assumption that all was, at some level not yet visible, perfectly well. It was a form of communal optimism that Miss Marple respected even when she did not share it. She spent the morning of the 8th in her garden, attending to the border along the east wall where the earliest bulbs were beginning to push through the cold soil with the quiet determination that she had always found admirable in growing things. A little before 11, she put away her trowel, washed her hands at the kitchen sink and put on her coat and hat. She had, she told herself, 1 or 2 small errands in the village. This was perfectly true, and it was also true that her route would take her past the coffee shop, and that she saw no reason why she should not stop to look. The notice was still there, closed until further notice in Miss Trent's careful hand, the card slightly pale from having rested against the glass overnight. The lights inside remained off. The tables, what could be seen of them through the lower portion of the window, were bare. No cups, no napkins laid out, none of the small signs of preparation that had always marked the shop's readiness to receive its visitors. And yet at the table by the window, the small table to the left of the door, the one with the slightly uneven leg that Miss Trent had compensated for with a folded piece of card, there was a cup. Miss Marple stood at the glass and looked at it with the calm attention she might have given to an unusual specimen in a garden border. It was an ordinary cup, white with a narrow blue line around the rim, of the kind Miss Trent used for all her customers. It sat in its saucer at a slight angle to the table's edge, as though it had been placed in haste or in the middle of some other action. It had not been cleared away, it had not been washed and stacked with the others behind the counter. It remained exactly where it had been set down, and even through the glass in the pale March light, there was something about its stillness that communicated quite clearly that it had been there for rather longer than cups are ordinarily left. She thought of warm coffee cooling. She thought of the hand that had placed the cup there, and the question of whether that hand had intended to return to it. Constable Reeves, who was the village's sole representative of official order, and who wore his uniform with the earnest dignity of someone who had recently completed his training and not yet had cause to depart from it, happened to pass along the pavement at that moment. He was a young man of perhaps 25, with a broad, well-meaning face and the slightly stiffened gait of someone concentrating on appearing at ease. "Good morning." "Miss Marple," he said, with the automatic courtesy of someone who recognised the importance of greeting elderly ladies with visible warmth. "Good morning, Constable Reeves," said Miss Marple. "I don't suppose you have any news of Miss Trent?" Constable Reeves paused, which was itself a form of answer. "Not as such," he said carefully. "I understand she stepped away for a bit. Family matter, it seems." "Has it seemed so?" said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I had not heard that." "Well," said Constable Reeves, with this slight diminishment of certainty that her tone had produced, "that's what's been said." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "And by whom, if you don't mind my asking?" Constable Reeves minded slightly, but was not certain he could say so without appearing unreasonable. "I believe it was Mr. Crail who mentioned it," he said. "He came to the station yesterday afternoon to ask whether there was any news, and said he'd heard it was a family matter." "How very thoughtful of Mr. Crail," said Miss Marple, "to inquire." She thanked the constable pleasantly, remarked that the snowdrops were doing well this year, and continued on her way. She found Mrs. Fellows at the post office, in the process of dispatching a parcel of some complexity, whose dimensions appeared to have exceeded, by a small but irritating margin, the requirements of the standard postal rate. Mrs. Fellows was engaged in a negotiation with the postmistress, Miss Roper, that had the settled air of a conversation already 10 minutes old, and which showed no immediate sign of resolution. Miss Marple waited with tranquil patience, and presently Mrs. Fellows, having accepted a compromise that satisfied no one entirely, turned from the counter and noticed her. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, with the particular warmth of someone who finds a welcome audience. "Have you heard anything further about poor Miss Trent?" "Very little," said Miss Marple. "I had hoped you might be better informed." Mrs. Fellows drew herself up slightly, which in her case was not so much a physical action as a settling of authority. "I know that she's not at the shop," she said, "and I know that Mrs. Hargreave at the end of Vicarage Lane says that she saw a light in the flat above the shop on Tuesday evening, which would have been the evening before the notice went up. So she must have been there then, at any rate." "The flat above the shop," said Miss Marple. "That is where Miss Trent lives." "She took it with the premises," said Mrs. Fellows. "It's quite adequate, I understand, though small. I've never been inside, naturally, but the light was there on Tuesday, and it was not there on Wednesday morning when Mrs. Hargreave went past, and she is a very attentive person on the subject of other people's lights." Miss Marple absorbed this. "And her belongings?" she asked, in the mild tone of someone asking after nothing in particular. "Does anyone know whether she's taken her things?" Mrs. Fellows blinked. It was evident that this question had not previously occurred to her as a practical one, and its practicality now struck her with some force. "I had assumed," she began, and then stopped. "Well," she said more carefully, "I don't know. I had simply assumed, that is, the notice says further notice, which implies she will return." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it does imply that." She parted from Mrs. Fellows with the cordial brevity of someone who has obtained what she came for, and has no wish to be impolite about it, and she went next to the ironmonger's at the far end of Market Lane, on the stated purpose of inquiring after a particular variety of garden cane that she had not been able to find elsewhere. The ironmonger's was a dim, honest shop that smelled of oil and metal, and the particular indefinable odour of useful things kept in proximity, and it was presided over by Mr. Hatch, who was 60, spare, and entirely without small talk. At the back of the shop, engaged in the reordering of a shelf of hinges with more concentration than the task strictly required, was young Mr. Geoffrey Peel. He noticed her at once. She had observed before that he was the sort of young man who noticed things, and came forward with slightly more readiness than might have been expected of a junior assistant greeting a customer inquiring after garden canes. "Miss Marple," he said. "Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Peel," she said, with a specific warmth she reserved for young people whom she found interesting. "I wonder whether you might help me." He helped her with the garden canes efficiently and without unnecessary conversation, but when she thanked him and turned slightly toward the door, she said, as though it had only just occurred to her, "I understand you were in the coffee shop on Tuesday afternoon." He did not look away, which she noted. "I stopped in after my dinner break," he said. "About 2:30? And how was Miss Trent?" A small pause. "Quite well," he said. "As usual." Was there anyone else in the shop at that time? He considered this with a care that was, she thought, slightly more careful than the question might naturally have demanded. "Mrs. Fellows had just left when I arrived," he said. "And Mr. Crail came in while I was there. He doesn't usually come in the afternoon, but he did that day." "I see," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "And was the shop busy otherwise?" "No," said Mr. Peel. "It was quite quiet." He hesitated for just a moment, then added in a tone from which he appeared to be removing something, "Miss Trent seemed a little distracted, perhaps, but that may have been nothing." "People often seem a little distracted," said Miss Marple, "when they have had cause to think carefully about something." He looked at her then with the expression of someone reassessing a situation they had believed they understood, and she gave him her most comfortable smile and thanked him again for the garden canes. She walked home by way of Market Lane, and she stopped once more before the window of the coffee shop. The cup was still there, precisely as it had been. No one had entered to clear it away, which meant no one had been inside, or no one had thought to do so, or someone had thought not to. She stood and looked at it for rather longer than a passing observer might have expected from a woman on her way home with a bundle of garden canes. The cup was on the left-hand table by the window, set at that slight angle. It would have been prepared for someone. Miss Trent was not, and in Miss Marple's experience of her, the sort of person to make a cup of coffee for herself and then abandon it. Her habits were too orderly for that. The shop was always kept with the particular tidiness of someone who has learned that small disciplines prevent larger disorders. The cup had been made for a visitor, and the visitor, for whatever reason, had not come back to it. Or, and this thought settled into Miss Marple's mind with the quiet finality of a completed observation, the visitor had come back to something else entirely, something that had made the cup beside the point, and Miss Trent had not been in any position after that to clear it away herself. She adjusted her grip on the garden canes, turned from the window and walked on through the thin March afternoon, which had grown, if anything, rather colder than the morning. The elm trees stood very still, the lane was empty. It occurred to her that she would need to speak with Mr. Norris Crail. Chapter 3. The ledger page. Stopped mid-entry. Mr. Norris Crail was not a man who invited casual conversation. There was about him the particular self-containment of someone who had, over many years, arranged his life into compartments and who found unannounced visitors to any of those compartments mildly unsettling, even when the visitor was as unthreatening in appearance as Miss Jane Marple. He occupied a set of rooms above the offices of Messrs. Harbottle and Finch, solicitors, at the quieter end of the High Street, a position that reflected in some neat way the general character of his existence. Above the business of others, separated from the street below by a suitable interval, and reached by a staircase that creaked on the third step in a manner that gave adequate warning of anyone's approach, Miss Marple was not a scarceste. On the morning of the 9th, intending to visit Mr. Crail at his rooms, she was a woman of patience, and she understood that certain conversations could not be forced without losing their value. What she had in mind was something rather more incidental, the sort of encounter that a village the size of St. Mary Mead could generally be relied upon to produce if one moved through it at the right pace and with a sufficiently open schedule. She had, in any case, a legitimate errand at Harbottle and Finch themselves, where Mr. Harbottle, a steady, cautious man who wore the same style of suit in a rotating variety of subdued colours, managed a small trust that had been established by Miss Marple's father many decades prior, and which produced quarterly a sum of money that was modest but reliable. There was a form to be signed. These things arose from time to time. She arrived at the offices at 10 minutes past 10, was seen without delay, signed the necessary form, and exchanged a few pleasantries with Mr. Harbottle, who was in good health and whose wife's neuralgia had improved considerably since she had begun taking the waters at a spa establishment somewhere in Derbyshire. Miss Marple expressed genuine interest in this, because she was genuinely interested in most things, and she was still engaged in the pleasant formalities of departure when the door from the inner corridor opened and Mr. Norris Crail appeared. He stopped when he saw her, which was natural enough, and he produced a smile, which was also natural, though it was the kind of smile that arrives slightly after it should. "Miss Marple," he said, "good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Crail," she said. "What a pleasant coincidence. I have just been in to see Mr. Harbottle about a trifling matter." "Quite," said Mr. Crail. He was carrying a thin folder of papers, which he held with the slight additional pressure of someone who does not wish to appear to be carrying anything of significance. "I was so sorry to hear about the coffee shop," she said, in the mild, conversational tone that she used for remarks she particularly wished to observe the effect of. "Such an agreeable place. I do hope Miss Trent is well." "I'm sure she is," said Mr. Crail, after a moment that was precisely the length of a moment in which a person is deciding how much certainty to invest in a statement. "Have you heard from her at all?" Miss Marple asked, with the friendly persistence of someone asking after a mutual acquaintance. I ask only because I understand you were kind enough to look into the matter with the constable." Mr. Crail's expression adjusted slightly, not so much a reaction as a recalibration. "I happened to pass the station," he said, "and thought it responsible to mention that she appeared to have closed, in case anyone had reported a concern." "Very thoughtful," said Miss Marple, for the second time in 2 days on the same subject, and meaning it rather differently on each occasion. "And had anyone?" "I don't believe so," he said. "As I understand it, she's taken a short leave. Family reasons." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "So I had heard." She gave him a pleasantly vague smile and moved toward the door. "Well, I mustn't keep you. These March mornings don't linger, do they? Good day, Mr. Crail." She felt, as she descended the 2 steps to the pavement, that she'd confirmed at least one useful thing. Mr. Crail had introduced the explanation of a family matter to the constable, and he had now offered it to her, in almost the same words, with the smoothness of someone who has prepared a phrase in advance. The difficulty with prepared phrases is that they are often more visible than the person offering them realizes. It was Mrs. Fellows who provided the next useful development, as she occasionally did, through no particular intention of her own. She appeared at Miss Marple's gate at 2:30 that afternoon, ostensibly to return a book she had borrowed some weeks earlier, and in practice to report that Constable Reeves had been into the coffee shop. "Into it?" said Miss Marple with appropriate interest. "How did he manage that?" "The key was with the letting agent," said Mrs. Fellows, with the satisfaction of someone who has already conducted a thorough inquiry. "Mr. Good, on the Paddock Road. Apparently there had been a query, I'm not entirely certain from whom, about whether the premises were secure, and so Constable Reeves went in to have a look." "And what did he find?" said Miss Marple. "Nothing amiss," said Mrs. Fellows, with a slight diminishment of enthusiasm that suggested this was not the answer she would have chosen. "Everything in order," he said, except for a cup on the table by the window, which he thought had probably been forgotten, and the ledger on the counter, which was left open. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "The ledger," she said. "The accounts book," said Mrs. Fellows. "The one Miss Trent used for her daily takings, I imagine. Constable Reeves said it was open on the counter, with an entry that hadn't been finished. The last line was only half written." She paused with the air of someone who has saved the most interesting detail. "He said the pen was still beside it." Miss Marple considered this for a moment. "The pen was still beside it," she repeated quietly. "Not put away." "Laid on the counter," said Mrs. Fellows, as though she had just set it down. After Mrs. Fellows had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while in the chair by her sitting-room window, with her hands folded over her knitting, and her eyes resting on the garden without particularly seeing it. She was thinking about ledgers, not this one specifically, but the general nature of them. A daily accounts book is the most habitual of documents. Its entries are made at a fixed time, at the end of each working period, and they are made in sequence, one line completing another, because the numbers require it. To leave such an entry unfinished was not simply to forget something. It was to be interrupted in the middle of an action so thoroughly conditioned by habit that only a significant interruption could have produced it. The cup, the pen, the unfinished line. 3 objects, all of them carrying the same message, each in its own register. Something had stopped. The following morning brought a development of a different kind. Miss Harriet Vane, the retired head mistress, not the writer, as she would no doubt have wished to clarify, appeared at the post office at the same moment as Miss Marple, which was the sort of convergence that a village of St. Mary Mead's dimensions produced with comfortable regularity. Miss Vane was a tall, angular woman of 68, with the upright carriage of someone who had spent several decades demonstrating to young people the correct way to enter a room. She had iron grey hair cut in a practical style, sharp eyes behind narrow spectacles, and a manner that was brisk without being unkind, the manner of someone who had always preferred clarity to comfort, and who was generally forgiven for it. She saw Miss Marple and came directly to the point, which was her custom. "I've been thinking about Tuesday," she said, without preamble. "Have you?" said Miss Marple. "So have I." They moved together away from the post office entrance as though by mutual agreement, and stood for a moment on the pavement in the thin morning sunlight. Miss Vane had the look of someone carrying a piece of information they had been uncertain how to deliver. "I was in the shop that Tuesday afternoon," she said. "I told Constable Reeves I'd called in around 3, stayed perhaps a quarter of an hour and left when the shop was still open. That is all true." "But," said Miss Marple, with the gentleness of someone who has heard the word approaching from some distance. Miss Vane's expression settled into something that was not quite discomfort, but was in the neighbourhood of it. "When I arrived, Miss Trent was at the counter with the ledger open in front of her. She was making an entry, and she appeared." Miss Vane paused, which was unusual for her. There was something about her manner. I had not seen her like that before. She was very controlled, as she always was, but underneath it there was something that I can only describe as resolution, as though she had made up her mind about something and was proceeding on that basis. "And was there anyone else in the shop when you arrived?" "Mr. Krell was just leaving," said Miss Vane. "He had his coat on and was moving toward the door. He greeted me, quite normally, quite pleasantly, and went out." "Did Miss Trent say anything after he'd gone?" Miss Vane thought about this with the precision of someone accustomed to weighing evidence. She said, "There we are, in rather a final sort of way, not as a conversational remark, more as though she were speaking to herself." She met Miss Marple's eyes with the directness that was characteristic of her. "I thought at the time it was nothing, but I have been thinking since that it was not nothing at all." "No," said Miss Marple, "I don't believe it was." They parted a few minutes later, and Miss Marple walked slowly back along the lane toward her cottage. The March air had the smell of damp stone and turned earth, and the distant suggestion of something growing. She thought about Miss Trent at her counter, ledger open, pen in hand, making an entry in her careful handwriting, the figures of the day set down in sequence, the record of ordinary commerce, the accumulation of small transactions that constituted the visible life of the shop. And then Mr. Krell had gone out, and she had said, "There we are," and something had shifted. Not outwardly, not in any way that could be plainly observed, but inwardly, in the manner of a decision already taken arriving at the moment of its consequence. The pen had been set down beside the ledger. The entry had been left where it was, its final line incomplete, and whatever had been necessary after that had not included finishing it. Miss Marple thought of the handwriting itself. Steady, Miss Vane had implied, and steady it had appeared to Constable Reeves when he looked at the ledger the following day. Not agitated, not hurried, steady, and then stopped. It is one thing, she reflected, to be frightened. It is another to have understood something, and to be acting upon that understanding with composure. The two produce rather different kinds of stillness. She had the strong impression that it was the second kind she was dealing with, which meant that Miss Trent, when she set down the pen and closed, or did not close, the ledger, had known quite clearly what she was doing and had chosen to do it. And that, in its own way, raised a question that the pen and the ledger and the cooling cup had not yet answered, whether the choice had been entirely her own. Chapter 4. The apron folded beneath the counter. Miss Marple had a niece, Raymond's wife's sister to be precise, which was a connection several steps removed from the direct line but nonetheless warmly maintained, who had once remarked that her great-aunt's most dangerous quality was not her intelligence, which was considerable, but her appearance of perfect harmlessness. It was, the niece had observed, rather like a naturalist's blind. You ceased to notice it was there, and then the naturalist inside it had seen everything. Miss Marple herself would not have used the word dangerous. She would have said simply that people were often more forthcoming when they did not feel themselves to be under examination. It was not a stratagem exactly. It was merely that she had learned to ask her questions in the form of conversation. And her conversation had the quality of good weather. People moved through it without thinking about it very much. On the morning of the 10th of March, the coffee shop was briefly entered for a second time, on this occasion by Mrs. Fellows, who had obtained permission from Mr. Good, the letting agent, on the grounds, which were entirely genuine, that she had left a pair of gloves in the shop on her last visit and wished to retrieve them. Mr. Good, who was a practical man with a moderate tolerance for the social energies of the village's more determined residents, had issued her the key with only a brief hesitation and the reasonable request that she return it promptly. Miss Marple had not suggested this arrangement. She had, however, been taking tea with Mrs. Fellows when the idea occurred to that lady, and she had listened to the plan being formed with the benign attention of someone who has no involvement in a matter whatsoever. Mrs. Fellows returned the key to Mr. Good at 11:15, and arrived at Miss Marple's cottage at past, still in her outdoor things, with the gloves, which were grey wool slightly felted at the fingertips, and an expression of considerable animation. "She didn't lock the till," said Mrs. Fellows, before she had fully settled into the chair offered to her. "The cash drawer. It was pulled closed but not locked. There were still coins in it." "Were there?" said Miss Marple, pouring tea. "And the apron," said Mrs. Fellows, accepting the cup with the automatic gratitude of someone whose mind is elsewhere. "I don't know whether you would think it significant, but I noticed it particularly. It was beneath the counter, not hanging on the hook behind the door where she always kept it, but folded and placed on the shelf below the counter. Quite neatly, folded in thirds." "Folded," said Miss Marple, "not simply taken off and set aside." "Deliberately folded," said Mrs. Fellows with emphasis. "I know the difference. My mother was a woman who folded things, and my sister was a woman who set things aside, and there is a very considerable difference in the result, and also in the state of mind that produces it." Miss Marple found this observation rather more penetrating than its origin might have suggested, and said so. Mrs. Fellows looked mildly pleased and drank some of her tea. "What strikes me," said Miss Marple after a moment, "is the combination of the two things, the drawer not locked and the apron folded. One suggests haste, or at least the absence of the usual closing routine. The other suggests care, the sort of care one takes over something that matters." Mrs. Fellows put down her cup. "You mean she had time to fold the apron but not to lock the till?" "Or," said Miss Marple gently, "she chose to fold the apron and did not choose to lock the till, which is a rather different thing." Mrs. Fellows sat with this for a moment. Outside, the March wind moved along the eaves of the cottage with a sound like someone turning pages. "Do you think she meant to come back?" she asked, and the animation had gone out of her voice, replaced by something more subdued. "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that the apron suggests she thought about what she was leaving behind, which is not quite the same as intending to return, and not quite the same as intending not to." This was not entirely satisfying as an answer, but it was as far as Miss Marple was prepared to go, and Mrs. Fellows, who had a good deal of native sensitivity beneath her sociable exterior, did not press the point. After she had gone, Miss Marple sat for a while with her knitting and thought about aprons. It was the kind of thinking she did best, not directed at a specific conclusion, but ranging across what she knew of human behaviour in the general way, following associations where they led and noting what appeared at their endings. An apron is a working garment. One puts it on to begin and removes it to finish. That Miss Trent had taken off her apron at all, in the middle of what appeared from the evidence of the ledger and the cup, and to have been the middle of the working afternoon, already indicated something. But folding it, and placing it with care below the counter, on the shelf where the spare cloths and the cleaning materials were kept, that was a different order of action entirely. She thought of the women she had known who folded things with that particular deliberateness. There was always, she had found, an element of marking about it, a final gesture, the sort of thing one did when one wished to leave a place as one would wish to be remembered in it, tidy, composed, with everything in its proper place except the person themselves. It occurred to her that she should like to speak with Mr. Crail again, but she was also aware that Mr. Crail was, in his own quiet way, alert to her interest, and that another direct approach would produce the same carefully prepared smoothness that their meeting at Harbertle and Finch had demonstrated. What she required was a context in which Mr. Crail would not feel himself to be specifically attended to. The opportunity came, as such things often do in villages, through the operation of something entirely unrelated. On the afternoon of the 11th, Miss Marple attended a meeting of the St. Mary Mead Reading Circle, which gathered monthly in the sitting room of the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, to discuss a work of literature chosen by rotating selection. The book under consideration that month was a collection of essays on the English countryside, which produced a generally agreeable conversation and no particular controversy, and the refreshments were, as always at Mrs. Clement's, reliably excellent. Mr. Crail was not a member of the reading circle. However, he passed the vicarage on his walk home from the office each afternoon at approximately 4:30, and it was one of the minor and entirely coincidental features of the vicarage's sitting room that its large bay window offered a clear view of the front path, and that Miss Marple, who had been given the chair nearest that window on account of the draught from the door, was positioned to observe anyone who passed along it. She saw him at 4:25. He was walking at his usual pace, which was measured and slightly deliberate, the walk of a man who had somewhere to go and was going there without hurry. He was carrying a briefcase and wearing his grey overcoat. He did not glance toward the vicarage window, which was, she thought, itself a thing worth noting. Most people passing a lit window on a dark afternoon glance at it instinctively. She excused herself at the earliest polite moment and contrived to be on the front path at the same time as the vicar, Mr. Clement, who was arriving home and who stopped to exchange a few words in the way of vicars, whose social obligations are continuous, and who have generally made their peace with this. "Ah, Mr. Crail," said Miss Marple, as that gentleman came level with the gate, and here the timing was either providential or the product of very careful calibration, and she was not entirely certain which. "What a cold evening!" Mr. Crail stopped. The smoothness was there, but it took, she thought, a fraction of a second longer to arrive than usual. "Miss Marple," he said. "Good afternoon." They spoke for a few minutes. The weather, the reading circle, the question of whether the church hall roof had been satisfactorily repaired after the autumn's difficulties. And then Miss Marple said, with the air of someone whose thoughts have wandered to a pleasant memory, "I keep thinking about the coffee shop. I had become quite fond of my Tuesday visits. Miss Trent made remarkably good coffee, which is rarer than it ought to be, in my experience." "She was very capable," said Mr. Crail. The past tense arrived without apparent awareness, and Miss Marple allowed it to pass without remark. "I wonder whether she kept much in the way of records," she said, in a musing tone. "Of the business, I mean. Some small establishments do and some do not. I always think a good ledger is really the truest portrait of how a place is doing." Something shifted in Mr. Crail's expression, very briefly and very carefully controlled, but she had been watching for something to shift and she caught it. "I wouldn't know about that," he said pleasantly. "I'm afraid I never took much notice of the business side of things." "Of course not," said Miss Marple. One goes for the coffee, not the accounts." They parted with mutual pleasantries, and she walked home in the early dark of the March evening with the cold air against her face and the satisfactory feeling of someone who has confirmed, with minimal expenditure, a thing she had already suspected. Mr. Crail had known about the ledger. The shift in his expression when she mentioned it had been too rapid and too controlled to be the natural reaction of a man to whom ledgers were a matter of indifference. He had thought about that ledger. He had, she rather thought about it considerably. What remained was the question of why. A coffee shop ledger, on the face of it, contained nothing of interest to a solicitor's clerk. Daily takings, small transactions, the ordinary arithmetic of a modest establishment. Unless there was something in it that was not entirely ordinary. Unless Miss Trent had recorded something that went beyond the notation of coffee and cake. She let herself into her cottage and stood for a moment in the hallway, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her in the cold. The apron folded beneath the counter. The entry left unfinished. The pen laid alongside, not put away. Miss Trent had been interrupted, or she had chosen to stop. Either way, the ledger contained something up to the point at which she had set down the pen, and nothing after, and whatever it contained, Miss Marple was now quite certain Mr. Crail would very much prefer that no one read it. Chapter 5. Footsteps marked behind the service door. There is a category of knowledge that circulates in villages entirely independently of any deliberate effort to circulate it. It is not gossip precisely. Gossip implies a degree of embellishment and a certain appetite for consequence that this quieter form of information does not possess. It is closer to what one might call the accumulated observation of people who spend a great deal of time in a small space and who notice, without necessarily intending to, the patterns that other people's lives inscribe upon their shared environment. A particular car parked at an unusual hour, a light in a window that is ordinarily dark by 9. The sound of a door closing in a building one generally associates with silence at that time of day. St. Mary Mead was well supplied with this kind of knowledge, and its principal custodian, though she would not have accepted the title, finding it undignified, was Miss Perpetua Roper, who kept the post office with Miss Roper, her unmarried sister, and who had, by virtue of her position and her naturally retentive mind, accumulated over many decades a quite extraordinary familiarity with the movements and habits of the village's entire population. She did not speak of what she knew indiscriminately. She was, in her way, rather discreet, but she responded to the right questions with the thoughtful generosity of someone who has long understood that information, correctly placed, can be more useful than money. Miss Marple had known Miss Roper for 30 years and understood her perfectly. She arrived at the post office on the morning of the 12th with a small packet to send to her niece in Torquay. The same niece, by a pleasing symmetry, whose parcel had brought her into the village on the morning of the 7th, the day she had first noticed the closed sign. The packet contained a jar of the damson preserve that her niece particularly liked, packed with the care appropriate to glass travelling through the postal system, and it provided an entirely legitimate reason for a counter-transaction of some duration. Miss Roper processed the packet with her customary efficiency. She was a compact woman of 62, with pale, watchful eyes, and the slightly compressed manner of someone who measures her words by weight rather than volume. She applied the stamps with 2 precise strokes of the dampening sponge and set the packet on the outgoing shelf before Miss Marple had fully extracted her purse. "I don't suppose," said Miss Marple, accepting her change, "that you have heard anything further about Miss Trent?" "Not as such," said Miss Roper. She paused, which with her was the equivalent of a more expansive person, drawing breath for a longer statement. Miss Marple waited. "I will say," said Miss Roper, "that there was something on the Tuesday that I've been turning over since. I don't know that it means anything." "These things often don't," said Miss Marple, which was her way of indicating that she very much wished to hear it regardless. "I was going past the back of Market Lane," said Miss Roper, "at somewhere near 4 o'clock. I had taken the long way back from Mrs. Allardyce's, on account of returning her fruitcake tin, which she had left at the Christmas sale and which I had only just remembered. The service alley runs along behind the shops there. You'll know it. Miss Marple did know it. The service alley was a narrow passage that ran parallel to the rear of the Market Lane shops, providing access for deliveries and the disposal of refuse. It was not a thoroughfare that residents used as a matter of course, being unpaved, frequently muddy, and enclosed on both sides by the backs of buildings, which gave it the slightly dim quality of a place designed for function rather than passage. "There is a door at the back of Miss Trent's premises," said Miss Roper. "A service door. She used it for taking in her coffee deliveries, I believe, and for putting out her bins on collection days. It was standing open. Not wide open, perhaps a foot or so, which I noticed because it was cold, and it seemed an odd thing to have a door standing open in that weather." "And was anyone near it?" said Miss Marple. "That," said Miss Roper, with the precision of someone who has spent considerable time establishing exactly what she had and had not seen, "is what I am not certain of. There were marks in the mud near the door. The alley is unpaved, as I said, and the ground had been soft from the overnight frost thawing during the morning. The marks were not clear footprints, not the sort one could identify, but they were the impressions of feet having stood there, and of movement of some kind. More than one set, I thought." "Coming or going?" said Miss Marple. "I couldn't say," said Miss Roper. "The ground was too disturbed for that. But they were fresh. The edges were still sharp, which they would not have been if they had been made much earlier in the day." She said this with the measured confidence of someone who has thought the observation through carefully, and is certain of its foundations, and Miss Marple received it in the same spirit. "The door was open," she said, half to herself, "and the marks were fresh." "At 4 o'clock, said Miss Roper, "which is half past the hour before the shop's usual closing." This was said simply, without inflection, and yet it contained within it the same quality of implication that a neatly placed bookmark contains. It marked a page one was expected to return to. Miss Marple thanked her, remarked that the damson preserve travelled better than one might expect given how perverse postal machinery could sometimes be, and took her leave. She walked home by way of the long route, not the route that took her past the front of the coffee shop along Market Lane, but the one that curved behind the terrace through the back streets and brought her, after a few minutes, to the entrance of the service alley. She had no intention of disturbing anything. She was simply someone taking a slightly longer walk on a cold March morning, which was not, in a village, a thing that required explanation. The alley was much as she had expected, narrow, unpaved, enclosed, and possessing that particular quality of utilitarian plainness that belongs to the back sides of things. The buildings on either side rose to a height that reduced the sky to a pale strip above. The ground underfoot was uneven, with a compressed granular texture of earth that freezes and thaws in alternation throughout the winter months. She did not attempt to enter the alley as far as Miss Trent's service door, which would have required passing the back entrances of 4 other establishments, and was, in any case, not what she had come to do. She stood at the entrance, and looked along the passage with the same unhurried attention she might have brought to a new border in a garden, not searching for anything specific, but allowing the general picture to assemble itself. What she observed was this. The alley was not a place one visited accidentally. It had no purpose for anyone who was not collecting a delivery or attending to refuse. A person found in it would, if challenged, require a reason to be there. And yet the marks Miss Roper had described, the impressions of more than one pair of feet, standing or moving near an open door at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of a working day, implied that at least 2 people had been there at precisely the time when the shop above was, by all evidence, in the process of ceasing to function. She thought about Mr. Crail. His route home from Harbottle and Finch did not take him through the alley. His natural path lay along the high street and down toward the residential quarter where his rooms were situated. For him to have been at the back of the coffee shop at 4 o'clock would have required a deliberate diversion, which was not impossible, but it was a choice, and choices of that kind are made for reasons. She thought also about young Mr. Peel, whose ironmonger's was 2 doors along from the coffee shop on the same side of Market Lane. The service entrance of the ironmonger's was in the same alley. He would have had a natural acquaintance with that passage. He had told her he was in the shop at 2:30. He had not mentioned what time he left, and she had not asked, which she now thought had been remiss of her. She walked on, and the alley receded behind her. That afternoon, she called in at the ironmonger's for a second time, on the equally legitimate errand of inquiring about a replacement latch for her garden gate, which had been giving difficulty since November, and which she had been meaning to see to. Mr. Hatch attended to her with his customary minimalism, and Mr. Peel appeared from the back of the shop with a selection of latches laid out on a piece of board, with the quiet competence of someone who understood his stock. They discussed the latches in appropriate detail. Miss Marple settled on one that suited both the gate and her budget, and while Mr. Peel was wrapping it, she said without particular emphasis, "I imagine you use the service alley for your deliveries here." "We do," he said, concentrating on the paper. "It must be a useful thoroughfare," she said, "for all the Market Lane shops." "It is," he said. He folded the paper corner with the neat efficiency of habit. "You would have noticed, I imagine, if there had been anything unusual there on Tuesday afternoon," she said, "you being familiar with the alley." He was still for just a moment, not long, but measurable. Then he completed the fold and reached for the string. "I didn't come out the back on Tuesday," he said. "We had no deliveries that day." "I see," said Miss Marple. "Of course." She paid for the latch and thanked him and went out. She stood briefly on the pavement of Market Lane in the cold afternoon air, turning the small wrapped package in her gloved hands. Mr. Peel had answered her question precisely. He had not gone out the back on Tuesday. He had said nothing about whether he had seen anyone else do so, which was, she thought, itself a kind of answer. The answer of a young man who has decided what to say, and is adhering to it carefully, leaving around the edges of his adherence a silence that he perhaps does not realize is quite as visible as the words. She looked up at the front of the coffee shop as she passed it. The notice was still there. The cup was still there, just visible through the glass. The pale March light fell across the window at an angle that made the interior look, for a moment, less like a closed room and more like a held breath. She walked on. There was more to be found, she was quite certain. The alley and its marks and the open door had told her that the final hour of the coffee shop's operation had not been a private one. Others had been there. Others had moved in the spaces that were not meant for customers, at a time when the visible front of the shop was proceeding toward its ordinary close. What she did not yet know was what had passed between them in that cold and functional space, and whether Miss Trent had been a participant in that passing or the object of it. Chapter 6. A parcel set aside without a name. It has been observed by various students of human nature, and Miss Marple counted herself without vanity among their number, that the most revealing conversations are rarely the ones that were intended to be revealing. The planned disclosure, the prepared confidence, the carefully arranged admission, these have about them a quality of management that blunts their edge. It is the unintended remark, the observation offered as a commonplace, the detail dropped into a conversation because it seemed too small to require any particular handling. These are the things that open doors. She was thinking about this on the morning of the 13th, as she sat at her writing desk attending to a letter to her nephew Raymond, he who had written the previous week with news of a professional success that required acknowledgement and a domestic complication that required sympathy. Both were provided in due measure, and she was addressing the envelope when she heard the gate, and then footsteps on the path, and then a knock at her door that had about it the particular rhythm of Mrs. Fellowes, 3 sharp, 1 soft, as though the final knock were an afterthought. Mrs. Fellowes came in bringing cold air, and the specific purposefulness of someone who has discovered something and has been waiting, with only partial success, for a reasonable hour at which to share it. She had been, she explained, speaking with Mrs. Good, the wife of the letting agent, a woman of pleasant temperament and occasional indiscretion, who was to her husband's professional discretion what a window thrown open is to a sealed room, and Mrs. Good had mentioned, in the course of a conversation about something else entirely, that when Constable Reeves had gone into the coffee shop to check the premises, he had found, in addition to the cup and the open ledger, a parcel. "A parcel," said Miss Marple. "Set on the shelf behind the counter," said Mrs. Fellows. "On the right-hand side, nearest the back, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, according to Mrs. Good, who had it from her husband, who had it from Constable Reeves at the time he returned the key. It had no name on it, no address, nothing at all written on the outside." "And what was done with it?" said Miss Marple. "Left where it was," said Mrs. Fellows. "Constable Reeves thought it belonged to the shop, a delivery of some kind that had been set aside for collection. He didn't think it his place to open it." She paused. Mrs. Good thought it odd, though. She said Miss Trent was always very particular about labelling things. She kept the shelf behind the counter very neatly organised, everything marked, everything in its place. A parcel with no label was out of character in her view. "Mrs. Good was acquainted with Miss Trent," said Miss Marple, with the mild interest of someone noting a connection she had not previously had occasion to consider. "She came into the shop occasionally," said Mrs. Fellows, "and she had dealt with her directly once or twice on matters relating to the tenancy. Small things, maintenance queries, that sort of arrangement. She said Miss Trent was the most organised tenant they had ever had, kept a record of every communication, replied to everything promptly and in writing." Miss Marple absorbed this carefully. She had formed, over her various encounters with the evidence of Miss Trent's habits. The ledger kept with steady regularity, the apron folded with deliberate care, the shop maintained in the particular order that characterises someone who finds disorder personally uncomfortable. A picture of a woman for whom systems were not merely convenient but fundamental. Such people did not leave parcels unlabelled. They labelled things precisely because unlabelled things introduced a small but insistent uncertainty into their environment. An uncertainty of that kind was the thing they were most constitutionally opposed to. An unlabelled parcel on Miss Trent's shelf was therefore not an oversight. It was an anomaly. And anomalies, in Miss Marple's experience, had explanations. They simply required the right approach to produce them. "Did Mrs. Good say anything about the size of it?" she asked. The parcel, Mrs. Fellows thought. She said it was not large. About the size of a book, she thought, or perhaps a little flatter, and she said it had been placed at the back of the shelf, not in the ordinary position where deliveries were set, which was nearer the front on the left. Placed at the back, out of the ordinary position, without a name. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Fellows for the information, offered her a second cup of tea, which was declined on account of a dental appointment at 11, and sat for a long time after she'd gone with her hands folded on the writing desk, and her letter to Raymond still unsealed beside her. She was thinking about the parcel, and about what category of object one wraps without labelling. Gifts, sometimes, but gifts are generally given directly, not set on a shelf behind a counter. Items being held for a person who will shortly arrive to collect them. But those are usually named, precisely because the shopkeeper must know for whom they are being kept. Items that have arrived without proper documentation and await clarification. But these would ordinarily be noted in the ledger, unless the parcel was not a received item, but a prepared one. Unless Miss Trent had wrapped something herself and placed it where she would not forget it, and had not labelled it because the label was, in the circumstances, unnecessary, because she knew what it contained and she knew for whom it was intended, and she had not anticipated that anyone other than herself would need to identify it, in which case the parcel was not an unlabelled thing at all. It was a labelled thing whose label existed in Miss Trent's mind rather than on its surface. This line of reasoning brought Miss Marple to a question she had been approaching from various directions for several days, without yet finding the right angle of entry. What precisely had Miss Trent known? And when had she known it? And what had she done with what she knew? The ledger entry left unfinished, the apron folded below the counter, the parcel placed quietly at the back of the shelf. These were not the actions of a woman in panic. They were the actions of a woman in the process of concluding something, methodically, composedly, in the manner of someone who has understood that a situation has reached the point beyond which ordinary continuation is no longer possible. And the parcel, wrapped and anonymous was part of that conclusion. She put on her coat and hat at 11:45 and walked into the village with a destination she had been postponing for reasons she now recognised as an excess of caution. Inspector Slack was not, in Miss Marple's experience, a man who received her observations with enthusiasm. He was a capable enough officer in the practical sense, thorough in his methods, reliable in his paperwork, and possessed of a genuine, if sometimes clumsily expressed commitment to doing his duty. But he had, over the years, developed in relation to Miss Marple the particular wariness of a man who has been surprised too many times by a source he had underestimated. He was not precisely grateful for this. He managed it by treating her initial observations with a polite scepticism that he gradually abandoned as events made abandonment necessary, and this pattern had repeated itself often enough that it might have been called a tradition if either of them had been disposed to regard it as such. The inspector was in the village that morning as it happened, dealing with a matter connected to a stolen bicycle that had turned up in the next parish, a case whose complexity appeared to have been somewhat overstated in the initial report, judging by his expression when Miss Marple found him outside the post office. He had the look of a man who has driven some distance to investigate something that did not, on closer examination, merit the distance. "Inspector Slack," said Miss Marple, "I wonder if I might have a word." The expression adjusted to the one he reserved specifically for her, alert, slightly guarded, and containing beneath its official surface the faint resignation of someone who has learned that these words are rarely followed by something simple. "Miss Marple," he said. "Certainly." She told him, with the concise clarity she was capable of when concision was called for, what she'd been observing. The open ledger and the pen, the folded apron and the unlocked till, the fresh marks in the service alley at 4:00, and now the parcel without a name. She told him that Mr. Crail had introduced the explanation of a family matter unprompted, and that he had reacted with more than ordinary attention to a casual mention of the ledger. She did not tell him her conclusions, because she had found over many years that conclusions presented too early had the paradoxical effect of closing minds that might otherwise have remained open. Inspector Slack listened. He had learned, against his natural inclinations, to listen when she spoke. He made 2 or 3 notes in the small book he carried, and then looked up with the expression of a man who is not yet convinced but who is not either, dismissing what he has heard. "The parcel is still in the shop," he said. "As far as I understand," said Miss Marple. "I'll have Reeves take a proper look," he said, with the tone of someone who has decided on an action that does not commit him to any particular interpretation. "And I'll make some inquiries about Miss Trent, relatives, known contacts, that sort of thing." "That would be very sensible," said Miss Marple. "I'm not saying there's anything in it," said Inspector Slack, which was his customary way of indicating that he thought there might be. "Of course not," said Miss Marple agreeably. She walked home with the composed satisfaction of someone who has set a thing in motion that needed setting in motion, and who is content to allow it to proceed at its own pace. The inspector would look at the parcel. The parcel would tell him something, or it would not. Either way, the fact of its existence was now a matter of official record, which was rather more durable than a detail known only to Mrs. Good and her husband and Constable Reeves, and, through the customary operations of village intelligence, to what was probably a moderately substantial number of additional people. She thought, as she turned into her own lane, and the gate came into sight with its imperfectly closing latch. She had not yet fitted the replacement, which required a screwdriver and a particular quality of attention that she had not today been able to spare. She thought that the parcel was the kind of detail that clarified rather than complicated. It suggested that Miss Trent had been preparing for something, that her departure, or whatever it was that had occurred, had not been entirely without anticipation on her part, which still left the question of whether she had anticipated it soon enough. Chapter 7. The chair. Near the window. Slightly shifted, there is a quality of attention that distinguishes the experienced observer from the merely curious one, and it has less to do with what one looks for than with how one looks. The curious person arrives at a scene with questions already formed and searches for their answers. The experienced observer arrives without questions and allows the scene to produce them. It is a discipline of receptivity, patient, unhurried, and considerably more productive than it appears to anyone watching from the outside, where it is easily mistaken for simply standing still. Miss Marple had been practicing this discipline for the better part of 7 decades, and she was very good at it. On the morning of the 14th of March, Inspector Slack returned to the coffee shop with Constable Reeves, and a somewhat more purposeful attitude than had characterised the constable's first visit. He had, as he told Miss Marple afterwards, in the slightly compressed manner of a man conveying information he has decided she's entitled to, without wishing to appear to have decided so, gone over the interior with care. The parcel had been examined. It contained, he reported, a small notebook. Not a financial record, nothing of that kind, but a personal notebook, written in Miss Trent's hand, covering a period of approximately 4 months. He'd taken it away for examination and declined, for the present, to elaborate on its contents other than to say that it was proving instructive. Miss Marple had received this with the composed gratitude of someone who had expected something of the sort, and was glad to have it confirmed. What Inspector Slack did not mention, and what reached Miss Marple by the afternoon, through the reliable medium of Mrs. Fellows, who had it from Mrs. Good, who had heard it at the draper's from a woman whose husband sometimes assisted the constabulary with their vehicle on an informal basis, was that the notebook contained entries relating to a series of transactions that did not appear in the shop ledger. Small sums noted on specific dates, with initials rather than names, paid in cash and received without receipt. The entries were precise, factual, and entirely without commentary. They had the quality, as Miss Marple thought of it when she heard this description, of a record kept not for use but for protection. This was, she reflected, a very particular kind of document. People who kept records of that nature were not, in her experience, doing so out of idle habit. They were doing so because they understood that a time might come when the record would matter, when the neat columns of dates and figures and initials would constitute, in some context she could not yet fully see, a form of evidence that oral testimony alone could not provide. Miss Trent had known something. She had been recording it, and she had wrapped the record and placed it where it would be found. Not prominently, not in the ledger itself, not in any place that an ordinary closing up of the shop would have produced it, but on the back of the shelf, in a position requiring someone to look specifically for something out of place. Which brought Miss Marple to the chair. She had been thinking about the chair since the second day, the small detail that Mrs. Fellows had not mentioned, and Constable Reeves had not mentioned, and which had therefore reached her not through any conversational channel, but through her own memory of the shop's interior as she had known it during her regular visits. The table by the window, the slightly uneven one with a piece of folded card beneath the leg, had always been arranged in a specific way, with its 2 chairs placed symmetrically on either side, angled very slightly inward in the manner of chairs at a table where 2 people are expected to face one another across a shared surface. This was not an arrangement Miss Trent had fussed over or adjusted between customers. It was simply how the table stood as a matter of settled habit. On the afternoon of the 7th, when Miss Marple had stood at the window looking in, the cup had been on the left side of the table, and the chair on the left, she was now quite certain, assembling the image from memory with the care she always brought to retrospective observation, had not been in its usual position. It had been shifted outward, turned very slightly away from the table, in the manner of a chair from which someone has recently risen without pausing to replace it. Not the chair on the far side, which would have been where a customer sitting opposite might have been expected. The near chair, the one closest to the window, from which the view along Market Lane was clearest. She thought about this as she walked that afternoon toward the vicarage, where she had been invited to take tea with Mrs. Clement, who was one of the more genuinely intelligent women in the village, and whose conversation was always worth the walk. The vicar's wife had known St. Mary Mead for 23 years, and had developed, as people do in long residence in small communities, a layered understanding of its inhabitants that was quite different in character from Miss Marple's own. less analytical perhaps, but more contextual, rooted in the accumulated texture of many years of parish life. Mrs. Clement was a slight, observant woman of 50, with an expression of mild, permanent amusement that occasionally misled people into taking her less seriously than was wise. She had made good tea, set out a plate of thin biscuits, and been perfectly willing, once the pleasantries had run their natural course, to discuss the matter of Miss Trent. "I didn't know her well," said Mrs. Clement, "but I liked her. She had the quality, not so common as one might hope, of attending to what one actually said rather than to what she expected one to be saying." "She was perceptive," said Miss Marple. "Very," said Mrs. Clement, though she wore it quietly. She paused, turning her cup in its saucer with the small ruminative gesture of someone sifting through recollection. "I went into the shop 3 or 4 weeks ago, the middle of February, I think, shortly after Valentine's Day, because I remember the card shop next door still had its display up. I stopped in for coffee on my way back from visiting old Mr. Pennick. She was serving another customer when I arrived. I sat at the table near the door to wait, and I couldn't help noticing that she seemed rather unlike herself." "In what way?" said Miss Marple. "She was quite composed on the surface, but she was watching the window, not in the way one watches the street from habit, or because there is something interesting to observe. She was watching it in the way one watches for a particular thing." Mrs. Clement considered this. "I have seen that expression before, in people who are expecting something they are not entirely sure they wish to see arrive." "And did anything arrive," said Miss Marple, "while you were there?" "Mr. Crail came past," said Mrs. Clement. "He didn't come in. He simply walked past the window on the pavement at his usual pace, but she saw him. And for a moment, quite a brief moment, her composure became something rather different. Not distress exactly, more the expression one wears when a calculation has been confirmed. The calculation has been confirmed." Miss Marple found this phrasing, delivered without particular emphasis by a woman who chose her words thoughtfully, considerably arresting. "She was an organised woman," said Miss Marple, almost to herself. "Exceptionally so," said Mrs. Clement. "She kept the shop as though she had designed it personally, and perhaps she had. Everything in its place, everything with a reason." She paused. "The chair by the window," she said unexpectedly. Miss Marple looked up. "I noticed it once when I was sitting at that table," said Mrs. Clement. "She had a habit of positioning it, the chair nearest the window, on the left, very slightly forward from where it would naturally go, just a few inches, as though she wished it to be a place from which the street could be seen to best advantage." She smiled faintly. "I thought at the time it was a matter of hospitality, making the best seat available for whoever wanted it, but I wondered afterwards whether she herself sometimes sat there." "To watch," said Miss Marple. "To watch," agreed Mrs. Clement. The chair near the window slightly shifted. If Miss Trent had been sitting there, watching for something or watching someone, and had risen suddenly, or with sufficient haste to leave the chair in the position of recent occupation, rather than considered arrangement, then the picture of that final afternoon assembled itself differently from any version Miss Marple had so far considered. Not Miss Trent serving a customer who had left a cup. Not Miss Trent interrupted in the middle of work. Miss Trent at the window watching, seeing something that had caused her to move, setting down or forgetting the cup she had brought there with her. She thanked Mrs. Clement for the tea and for the conversation, both of which had been, she said, exactly what the afternoon required. Mrs. Clement accepted this with the pleasant modesty of someone who suspects the compliment has a specific dimension she has not entirely identified, and showed her to the door with the composed good manners of a vicar's wife of long practice. The walk home took Miss Marple past the end of Market Lane. She did not turn down it. She had no need to look at the shop again tonight. She had what she needed from it for the present. The chair had been moved. The cup had been left. And Miss Trent, she now believed, had been sitting at the window, not serving, not working, but watching, at the moment when something outside had caused her to stand. Something, or someone coming along the lane. Something expected, or something earlier than expected. Mr. Crail had visited the shop that afternoon. He had been seen leaving at approximately the time Miss Harriet Vane arrived. Perhaps 2:30, perhaps a little before 3. But the service door in the alley had shown marks at 4 o'clock, and between 3 o'clock and 4, the shop had moved from a state of ordinary operation to one of irreversible conclusion. Whatever had happened in that interval, and at some point within it, Miss Trent had been at the window, watching for something she had been watching for, Miss Marple now believed, for the better part of a month. The question was no longer whether she had known. The question was what she had known, and whether it had been enough to protect her. The March evening closed round the lane, and the lights came on in the windows along the high street one by one, in the comfortable and indifferent way of the lights in windows that have no knowledge of what is being considered in the street outside them. Chapter 8. The backroom door left not quite closed. Miss Marple had, over the course of a long life, developed a very particular relationship with the hours between 9 and 11 in the evening. Other people used those hours for leisure, the wireless, a book, the comfortable disintegration of the day's accumulated tensions into the mild pleasure of doing nothing much. Miss Marple used them for thinking, not the active, directed thinking of someone working toward a conclusion, but the quieter, more lateral thinking that occurs when the conscious mind has been set aside, and the accumulated observations of the day are allowed to arrange themselves according to their own logic. She sat on the evening of the 14th with her knitting in her lap, not knitting it, merely holding it, see, in the way that one holds a familiar object for the comfort of its presence rather than its utility, and allowed her mind to move where it wished. It moved, with the inevitability of water finding a channel, to the back room. The back room of Trent's coffee shop was not a space that Miss Marple had ever entered. It was not a space that customers entered as a general rule. It was the room behind the serving counter, separated from the main area of the shop by a door that was kept, in the ordinary course of operations, firmly closed. Miss Marple had seen it only in the way one sees any private door in any establishment, as a rectangular interruption in the wall, its existence acknowledged and its contents unremarked. She knew it contained the usual domestic infrastructure of a small catering operation, the stores, the cleaning supplies, perhaps a small table for Miss Trent's own use during quiet periods. She knew this because she knew from general experience what such rooms always contained. What she did not know, and what had been mentioned in passing by Constable Reeves, and had lodged itself, without her quite noticing at the time, in the corner of her mind reserved for things requiring further consideration, was that the backroom door had been found not quite closed. Constable Reeves had said this to Inspector Slack, and Inspector Slack had mentioned it to her in the course of his account of the premises examination, and she had at the time been attending primarily to what he said about the notebook, and the detail of the door had sat quietly in its corner of her mind until this evening, when it presented itself for examination, only not quite closed, not open, which would have suggested haste or alarm, not properly closed, which would have suggested the orderly conclusion of the working day. But in that intermediate position, the position of a door through which someone has recently passed, and which has swung back almost to its resting point but not quite reached it, arrested by whatever slight irregularity of frame or hinge prevents its complete return, or alternatively left in that position deliberately, this distinction mattered. A door left almost closed by someone moving through it quickly is a door that has followed its own physics. A door left almost closed by someone who wished it to appear as though they had passed through it, without wishing to create the definitive sound of its latch engaging. That was a different thing entirely. That was a door managed by someone who understood the acoustics of the space and was attending to them. She put down her knitting, found her small notebook, and wrote in it the words, "back room door," and beside them a question mark, and then the words from which side, and beside those a second question mark. It was a habit she had maintained for many years, this notation of things not yet resolved, arranged in the plain language of simple questions, and she found it useful as discipline, The questions written down had a way of clarifying what they actually required. From which side had the door been left almost closed? If from the interior, that is, by someone moving from the back room into the shop, then whoever had been in the back room had come forward into the main space, and had not subsequently returned to close the door behind them. If from the exterior, by someone moving from the shop into the back room, then the direction of travel was reversed, and the person had gone in and not come back out through that door. She thought about the service entrance in the alley, a door in from outside, a door between the back room and the shop not quite closed. These two doors, considered together, described a route. Someone could have entered from the alley through the service door, moved through the back room, and emerged, or partially emerged, into the main area of the shop. Or conversely, someone from the main area had retreated into the back room and left that way. She thought also about what Mrs. Clement had said, and about the chair by the window. Miss Trent, watching. Something seen in the street causing her to rise, and then... what? A movement toward the back of the shop, perhaps, toward the counter, where the ledger lay open and the pen rested alongside it, toward the back room door, toward whatever was beyond it. In the morning, she made a decision that had been forming for several days without her having directly acknowledged it. She would speak to Mr. Geoffrey Peel properly, not in the context of a purchase, not in the managed incidentality of a chance encounter, but plainly with the directness that she sometimes held in reserve for moments when indirectness had served its purpose, and there was no further value in continuing to approach a matter at an angle. She found him on the afternoon of the 15th at 5:15, which was 5 minutes after the ironmonger's close for the day, and which was, she had noted during her 2 previous visits, the time at which he generally emerged from the side entrance of the building and began his walk home along the lower lane. She was there, ostensibly, because she had been visiting the lending library, which was in that direction, and had simply found herself in his path. Whether he believed this she could not entirely judge. She thought he was acute enough to have his doubts, but polite enough not to express them. "Mr. Peel," she said, walking alongside him for a few steps in the natural way of 2 people moving in the same direction. "I wonder whether I might ask you something directly." "Yes," he said after a brief pause that was not quite surprise and not quite its absence. "The back room of the coffee shop," she said. "You have been in it, I think." He did not deny it. He walked 2 or 3 more steps before he spoke, and when he did, his voice had the quality of someone who has been carrying something for longer than is comfortable and has been offered, with uncertain motives, a surface on which to set it down. "Once," he said. "Miss Trent showed me it, about 3 weeks before the shop closed. She said she wanted someone to know the layout in case it was needed." "In case it was needed," Miss Marple repeated. "She used that phrase?" "Yes." He glanced at her sideways quickly. She was very deliberate about the words she used. "I noticed that about her." "What is in the back room?" said Miss Marple. "A small table, a storeroom for supplies, a shelf with her files and papers, very neatly ordered, and a second door which opens onto the service alley." He paused. "She showed me where the key was kept, on a hook inside the frame of the window, above the latch. She said it was always kept there." So the route was confirmed, from the alley through the service door, if one knew where the key was kept, and into the back room, and from there, almost, into the shop itself. "Did she tell you why?" said Miss Marple. "Why she was showing you?" A longer pause this time. The lower lane was quiet in the early evening, the light failing in its gradual marchway, the bare hedgerows on either side acquiring that particular indistinct quality of things seen at the edge of available illumination. "She said," he began carefully, "that she had been keeping a record of something. That the record was in the shop, put somewhere a person looking for it wouldn't immediately find it. And she said that if she were not there to explain it herself, she thought it would be better if someone else knew where to look." He stopped walking for a moment, which caused Miss Marple to stop also, and he looked at her with the expression of a young man who has arrived, by a route he did not entirely choose, at the point of honesty. She didn't say what she was afraid of, not in those words, but she was afraid of something, and she'd been afraid of it for a while. "And on the Tuesday," said Miss Marple gently, "were you in the alley?" The question rested between them in the cold air. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she thought that he was not a dishonest young man, merely a cautious one, which was rather different, and considerably more hopeful. "I saw her go into the back room," he said finally, "through the alley door, at about 10 minutes past 4. She had come from the service entrance herself. She had the key, so she had gone out that way, and she went back in the same way." He stopped. "She was alone when she went in, but the door from the alley had been opened from the inside before she got there. I could see it was already ajar." Miss Marple was quite still. "Someone was already in the back room," she said. "The door was ajar," he said. "I don't know who was there, I couldn't see, and then she went in, and the door closed, and I didn't stay." He said this last with the look of a young man who has since found his own decision very difficult to live with. "I didn't think, I wasn't certain." "No," said Miss Marple, with a kindness that was entirely genuine. "These things are rarely certain at the time." She thanked him, and they parted at the end of the lane, and she walked home through the falling dark with the cold settled properly now in the air around her, and the sense, familiar and not entirely comfortable, of a picture that has just acquired its final necessary detail. The backroom door, left not quite closed, not by accident, and not by the physics of a door following its own inclination. Left that way by the last person to pass through it, from the inside moving out, moving through the shop perhaps, or out again through the alley, leaving behind them a door that was almost closed but not quite, in the manner of a departure that wished to leave no definitive trace, and Miss Trent arriving at that open alley door, knowing already what she would find inside. The question of whether it had been enough to protect her pressed itself upon Miss Marple with renewed insistence. The question of where Miss Trent was now pressed itself with greater insistence still. She let herself into her cottage and stood for a moment in the hallway, as she had stood a week before listening to the house around her. Then she went to her writing desk, took out a sheet of paper and began a letter, not to her nephew Raymond this time, and not a social communication of any ordinary kind, but a careful summary of what she knew and what she suspected, and the order in which the evidence had presented itself. She wrote it with the same steady deliberateness with which she imagined Miss Trent had once written her own private record, not for immediate use, but for protection, against the possibility that someone ought to know, in case she were not there to explain it herself. She sealed it and addressed it to Inspector Slack. She would post it in the morning. It seemed the appropriate precaution. Chapter 9. The Time. No one mentioned clearly. The letter was posted at 8:30 on the morning of the 16th, and by 10 o'clock Inspector Slack had telephoned Miss Marple's cottage to say that he had received it and found its contents, as he put it, worth considering. This was, in the inspector's vocabulary, the approximate equivalent of another man saying that he had found them invaluable, and Miss Marple received it in that spirit. He came to see her at 11. He sat in the chair that visitors generally occupied, a solid, upholstered affair near the window that managed to appear both comfortable and faintly judicial, and he read through her letter again while she poured tea, which he accepted without appearing to notice that he was doing so. Then he set the letter on his knee and looked at her with the expression that was, by now, one she knew well, the expression of a man who has arrived at a position he did not quite intend to occupy, and who is assessing it, with the professional competence of long practice, for its structural soundness. "Mr. Peel," he said, "he confirmed the alley door." "He did," said Miss Marple, "and he didn't mention this earlier because he was not certain what he had seen," said Miss Marple, "and because he is a young man who is careful about making assertions he cannot fully support, which is, in its way, rather admirable, even if it has occasioned some delay." Inspector Slack appeared to consider this. "He'll need to make a proper statement." "I imagine he'll be entirely willing to do so," said Miss Marple. "I believe the not saying has been heavier for him than the saying would have been." The inspector nodded, a single considered nod of the kind that substitutes for several sentences. He drank some of his tea and then said, with the careful neutrality of someone approaching a topic they have been circling for several minutes, "The notebook." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "The entries," he said, "cover a period from the 12th of November to the 4th of March, 12 weeks. The last entry is dated the Tuesday, the afternoon of the closure." He paused. "The initials used throughout are NC." Miss Marple set down her cup with the composed unhurriedness of someone who had expected this and was not in any particular hurry to seem so. "I see," she said. "The sums are not large individually," said Inspector Slack, "but they accumulate. Over the 12 weeks, the total recorded is a little over £60, paid in cash. The entries note the date, the amount, and a brief description. 1 or 2 words only. Things like, as agreed, renewal, continuation, nothing that specifies the nature of the arrangement. But sufficient," said Miss Marple, "to establish its existence." "More than sufficient," said the inspector. He leaned back slightly in the chair, which registered his weight, with a small but dignified protest. "What we don't yet have is Miss Trent herself. We know she's not in the flat above the shop. The flat was checked properly yesterday, with a key obtained from the landlord, and there is no one there and nothing to suggest recent habitation since the Tuesday. We know she has family in Derby, a sister, and we have made contact. The sister has not seen her. She has not used her account at the village post office savings bank since the 8th, the day after the closure." The quality of the silence that followed this was particular. Miss Marple was aware of it, and she thought the inspector was aware of it too, and that they were both in their different ways attending to what it contained. "The flat," said Miss Marple after a moment. "Was there anything in it that suggested preparation? Clothing removed? Personal items taken?" "That's the thing," said Inspector Slack. "No, her things are there. Not all of them, perhaps. It's difficult to be certain without knowing the full inventory of a person's possessions. But the obvious things, her winter coat, books, the usual objects of daily life, and nothing arranged in the manner of someone who had planned to be away." "Then she didn't leave from the flat," said Miss Marple. "Whatever occurred, it occurred from the shop, from the back room." "It appears so," said the inspector, which was his way of agreeing without committing himself formally to the agreement. They sat for a moment in the particular companionship of 2 people who have arrived, by different routes, at the same uncomfortable conclusion, and who are each allowing the other time to settle into it. "There is something else," said Miss Marple presently. "Is there?" said Inspector Slack in the tone of a man who had expected this. "The afternoon of the 7th, she said. "The afternoon the shop closed. I have been thinking about the accounts each person gave of their movements, and there is a quality to those accounts that I have been attempting to identify precisely." She paused, choosing her words with the care she always brought to the moments when precision mattered most. When a group of people have each been in a place at different times during an afternoon and are subsequently asked to describe their visits, they tend, in the ordinary way, to be quite specific about time. People know when they went somewhere. They know roughly how long they stayed. The specific hour is one of the first things one can generally establish. "Generally," said Inspector Slack. "In this case," said Miss Marple, "I have found that every person connected with the coffee shop on that afternoon has been remarkably consistent in one particular. Not one of them has offered a clear account of the period between 3 o'clock and 4. Mr. Peel placed himself in the shop at 2:30. Miss Vane arrived at approximately 3 and found Mr. Crail departing. But what happened in the shop between 3 and 4, who was there, what was said, what was seen, has been, in every account I have heard, either absent or treated with a vagueness that sits oddly against the general precision with which people remember the rest of the day." The inspector had his small notebook open now, though he was not writing in it. He was simply holding it, in the manner of someone who wishes to appear to be collecting information while actually thinking about something else entirely. "Mrs. Fellows," said Miss Marple, "told me she came in the early afternoon and left before 3. She was very precise about the morning and the earlier part of the afternoon. She was considerably less precise about the moment of her departure. She said before 3, but when I asked what had prompted her to leave, She said she simply felt it was time, which is not, if one examines it, an answer that contains any real information. And Miss Vane? Miss Vane told me she arrived around 3 and stayed a quarter of an hour. She is a precise woman as a rule. I have found her consistently so. But she gave me no account of what occurred in the shop during her visit beyond the one detail she volunteered, Mr. Crail's departure and Miss Trent's remark. She did not say whether other customers were present. She did not mention whether the shop seemed otherwise normal. These are things that Miss Vane, who notices her surroundings, would ordinarily have observed. Inspector Slack looked at her steadily. You think she knows more than she said? I think, said Miss Marple carefully, that she may have seen or heard something during that quarter of an hour that she is not yet determined how to describe. Miss Vane is not a woman who dissembles, in my experience. She is, however, a woman who does not speak until she's confident in the accuracy of what she's going to say. And I think there is something she's not yet confident about. I'll speak with her, said the inspector. If you do, said Miss Marple, it might be worth approaching the question of the time gently. Not what did you see at 3 o'clock, but rather, do you remember what was on the table when you arrived? Was the cup already there? Was the ledger open? These are small, specific questions, and people who are uncertain about large things are often quite clear about small ones. Inspector Slack wrote something in his notebook at last. He wrote for a moment longer than the exchange might have seemed to require, which suggested he was noting something in addition to what she had said, something of his own, which was, she thought, always a good sign. He left at 12:30. Having accepted a second cup of tea with the same unawareness with which he had accepted the first, and having said at the door that he would be making further inquiries and would let her know of any developments that he was in a position to share. This final qualification was delivered with a slight awkwardness that she found rather endearing. It was the awkwardness of a man who has found himself, over many years of unwilling collaboration, genuinely uncertain about where his professional boundaries lie in relation to a specific elderly lady, and who has not entirely resolved the question. Miss Marple spent the afternoon quietly. She did some knitting. She attended to a correspondence she'd been neglecting. She drank tea at 4 o'clock and looked out at the garden, where the March light was doing something almost promising to the far border, and she thought about the hour that no one had mentioned clearly. 3 o'clock to 4, the cup made and not collected, the ledger entry begun and not finished, the pen set down, the apron folded, the back-room door almost closed, the service alley entered and exited by persons unknown, all of it occurring in that 1 hour, with no one willing to place themselves precisely within it. There was a word for the kind of vagueness that settles around a specific period of time when several people who were present have, independently, decided not to be specific about it. The word was not conspiracy. That was too deliberate, too coordinated, and implied a conversation that she did not believe had taken place. Yes, it was closer to what she thought of as shared discretion, the instinctive, unspoken agreement of people who have each witnessed something difficult and who have each separately arrived at the conclusion that clarity would cost more than they are yet prepared to pay. Whatever had occurred in the coffee shop between 3 and 4 on the 7th of March, more than one person had seen something of it, and more than one person had since then been living with the weight of what they had seen and had not said. That weight, in Miss Marple's experience, always eventually required setting down. The question was simply who would set it down first, and where it would land when they did. She rather thought she knew the answer to both. Chapter 10. The Last Cup Never Collected. The matter resolved itself as the most serious matters in St. Mary Mead tended to do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of quieter ones, each following the last with the unhurried logic of a tide coming in. Inspector Slack spoke with Miss Harriet Vane on the morning of the 17th. He spoke with Mrs. Ida Fellows that same afternoon, and on the evening of the 18th he spoke with Mr. Norris Crail at the offices of Harbottle and Finch, in the presence of Mr. Harbottle himself, who sat throughout the conversation with the expression of a man reassessing a professional association of many years' standing and finding the reassessment deeply uncomfortable. Miss Marple learned the outline of these conversations over the course of several days, partly through Inspector Slack, who came to see her on the 20th with the formal courtesy of someone discharging an obligation he has arrived at willingly, and partly through the customary operations of village life, which continued to distribute information with its customary generosity. What Miss Vane had finally described, with the precision she brought to all things, once she had satisfied herself that she was describing accurately, was this. When she had arrived at the coffee shop at approximately 3 o'clock on the Tuesday afternoon, Miss Trent had been standing behind the counter rather than moving through the room as she usually did. She had been very still, and across the counter from her, seated at the stool nearest the service end, had been Mr. Crail, who had his coat on and his hat on the counter beside him, as though he had arrived intending to stay briefly, and had stayed longer than intended. They had been speaking quietly, and they had stopped speaking when Miss Vane entered, in the specific way of two people who have been discussing something that does not require a witness. She had taken her usual table. Mr. Crail had collected his hat, said good afternoon to both women with his customary composure, and departed. And Miss Trent had said, in that particular tone, "There we are." And then she had poured Miss Vane's coffee and returned to the counter and stood there, and Miss Vane had read 3 pages of her library book without retaining a word of them, because the atmosphere in the shop had been, she said, of the kind that makes reading very difficult. Not hostile, not frightened. Something more considered than either. The atmosphere, she said after a pause, of a decision recently confirmed. She had not mentioned this before, she told the inspector, because she had not been certain what she had witnessed, and because Miss Trent was a private woman, and she had wished to respect that privacy until it became clear that respecting it was no longer serving any useful purpose. When the inspector put it to her gently that the useful purpose it might have served was a timelier investigation, she accepted this with the straight-backed composure of a woman who has already said the same thing to herself, rather more plainly, in the privacy of her own rooms. Mrs. Fellows, for her part, had not left before 3. She had left at approximately 3:30, and she had done so because, passing the window on her way to the door, she had seen a man in the service alley, visible only for a moment at the angle of the alley's entrance, before he moved out of her line of sight. She had not recognized him with certainty. She had thought, at the time, that it was probably a delivery person. She had thought, in the days since, that it had not moved like a delivery person. It had moved like someone who wished to be somewhere, without being seen to be there, which is a different quality of movement, and one that Mrs. Fellows, who was a more observant woman than she sometimes appeared, had noticed, and then persuaded herself she had not noticed, because the alternative was more complicated than she had wished to engage with. She cried a little when she told Inspector Slack this, and the inspector, who had not always been noted for his delicacy in such moments, handled it with a decency that Miss Marple, when she heard of it, found quietly heartening. As for Mr. Norris Crail, he did not confess precisely. He was too composed a man for confession, which requires a certain surrender that he was temperamentally incapable of. What he did was to offer, in the measured language of a man accustomed to precision in documents, an account that explained rather more than it concealed, and which Inspector Slack, who had by now the notebook and Mr. Peel's statement and Miss Vane's account and Mrs. Fellows's account and the ledger and the evidence of the alley, who had, in short, rather a great deal, received without requiring Mr. Crail to say anything he had not chosen to say. The arrangement had begun in November. Miss Trent had come to Harbottle and Finch on a matter connected with the tenancy, and had encountered Mr. Crail in the course of that visit, and had recognised him. Recognised him specifically in connection with a matter she had been aware of before she came to St. Mary Mead, a matter involving a sum of money, a trust account, and a series of transactions that had been represented to their beneficiaries in terms that were, at best, significantly incomplete. She had known about it because her own modest savings had once been managed through a firm connected at a remove to the same arrangement, and she had lost them quietly and without recourse several years before. She had not gone to the police at that time. She told no one who could repeat it. Insufficient evidence and insufficient confidence that she would be believed. She was a woman alone, in a new place, managing a small business, and she had made the calculation, as many people in her position make it, that the likely cost of speaking outweighed the uncertain benefit. But she had begun to keep records. The entries in the notebook were not records of payments she had received. They were records of payments she had traced, through information she had accumulated with the patience and thoroughness that characterized everything she did, to transactions she could now associate with specific dates and specific sums and, in 12 cases, specific initials. She had been building something. Not quickly, but carefully, in the manner of someone who intends what they construct to be durable. When Mr. Crail had understood what she had, he had come to an arrangement with her. The weekly payments recorded in the notebook were, Miss Marple understood, his attempt to purchase her silence and her departure, to make it worth her while to close the shop, move away and leave the matter where it was. He had believed, or had wished to believe, that she would eventually accept this. He had misjudged her. On the Tuesday afternoon she had told him, in the quiet and final tone that Miss Vane had correctly identified as the atmosphere of a decision confirmed, that the arrangement was ending, not on his terms, on hers. She had the notebook, and she had written to a solicitor in Derby, her sister's solicitor, a man of no connection to Harbottle and Finch, and the letter had been posted that morning. Mr. Crail's visit to the office that afternoon had not been entirely voluntary. She had sent him a note, asking him to come, because she wished to tell him herself before the letter arrived. He had gone into the back room after she spoke to him. She had allowed it. There was nothing there for him to disturb because the notebook was already in its brown paper, already on the shelf, already in the position she had shown to Mr. Peel 3 weeks earlier. He had stood in the back room for perhaps 10 minutes, and then he had let himself out through the service door, having replaced the alley key on its hook, and he had walked back to his office along the high street, and he had told no one anything. And Miss Trent had come back through the alley herself shortly after, to check, Miss Marple believed, that the notebook was undisturbed, and had then closed the shop, turned the sign, put up the notice, folded her apron and gone upstairs to her flat. She had not left the village that night. She had left the following morning, on the first bus to the town, and from there by train to Derby, where she was now, had been since the 8th, staying with her sister, and meeting at intervals with her sister's solicitor, who was in the process of submitting to the appropriate authorities a document that was rather more comprehensive than anyone connected with the matter had anticipated. She was, Inspector Slack confirmed, entirely well. She had not been harmed. She had, in the specific sense of the word, won, though it was not a word that Miss Marple would have chosen, because it implied a contest. And what she had done seemed to her rather more like the completion of a long and patient project than the conclusion of a fight. Miss Marple communicated with her once by letter, about 10 days after the matter had become sufficiently clear that a letter was appropriate. She did not say very much. She said that she was glad Miss Trent was well, and that she hoped the coffee shop might reopen in time, because it had been a great pleasure to the village, and its absence was noted. She said 1 or 2 other small things, of the kind that letters between women of different generations but similar dispositions tend to contain, things that are neither advice nor sentiment exactly, but occupy the space between them. Miss Trent replied, briefly and warmly, to say that she intended to return in April, and that she would be grateful for Miss Marple's custom when she did. The matter settled into the village over the following weeks with the gradual quietness of something that has been resolved without public drama. There were conversations, of course. This was St. Mary Mead, and conversations were its natural medium, but they were, on the whole, conversations of the more subdued kind, in which the dominant note was something closer to relief than sensation. Mr. Crail resigned from his position at Harbottle and Finch. Mr. Harbottle said very little about this publicly, which was perhaps the most eloquent statement available to him. Constable Reeves was commended, in terms that were modest but genuine, for his initial attention to the premises, Inspector Slack accepted Miss Marple's thanks with the gruff deflection of a man who has decided, after much internal negotiation, that he does not mind them as much as he used to. It was Mrs. Bantry who raised the subject, one afternoon in the last week of March, when she had come to take tea and they were sitting by the window with the garden showing at last the first unmistakable signs of what was coming. She had heard the whole of it, in the compressed and accurate form that Miss Marple had provided, and she had sat for some time afterwards in the thoughtful silence of someone turning a thing over until it was